you ever seen a near-billion-dollar empire collapse because of something that seemed so small? Not because of an economic crisis, not because of dirty competitors, but because of a single moment of condescension played out in front of hundreds of watching eyes. That woman believed she was restoring order, but she had no idea that the man standing before her was the one holding everyone's fate in his hands. If you leave now, you will miss the moment when arrogance pays the most expensive price of a lifetime. Washington, D.C. at night has a beauty all its own. Not as loud as New York, not as flamboyant as Los Angeles. This city doesn't need to show off because real power never needs to speak. Liberty Hall stood tall in the heart of the historic district, illuminated by warm golden lights. Inside, crystal chandeliers hung high, casting their reflections onto the marble floor, creating an atmosphere that was both grand and cold. This was the National Security and Innovation Fundraising Dinner, a charity gala whose name sounded humanitarian, but everyone in this room understood perfectly. This was where decisions worth hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars were made. This was where you sat sometimes mattered more than who you were. Every chair carried meaning. Every table was a silent declaration of social standing. And Evelyn Harrington understood that better than anyone. Evelyn entered the grand hall with a slow, confident stride, as if this space had belonged to her for a very long time. In truth, it had. 44 years old, born into an East Coast old money family, married to Thomas Harrington, CEO of Harrington Dynamics, a defense corporation once considered the pride of the entire family lineage. Evelyn didn't need a name badge. She didn't need introductions. With just a sweep of her gaze, those around her instinctively knew where they belonged. She wore a deep, wine-colored evening gown, perfectly tailored, just enough to project status without appearing ostentatious. Her jewelry was minimal, but every piece was a statement of quiet power. Evelyn didn't smile often, because to her smiles were reserved for equals. From the very first moments, the way Evelyn surveyed the room said everything. She noticed who was shaking hands with who had been invited to the central tables, who was trying to slip into conversations not meant for them. And she also noticed who did not belong here. A server accidentally spilled a few drops of water while pouring wine. Evelyn said nothing, only raised an eyebrow slightly. The manager appeared immediately, bowed in apology, and pulled the server away. A young security staff member stood slightly out of position. Evelyn glanced at Thomas and subtly shook her head. Minutes later, the guard was reassigned elsewhere. No words, no orders. Evelyn's power was understood, not announced. Thomas Harrington walked beside his wife, but his confidence was far less solid than his appearance suggested. 47 years old, second-generation CEO. He understood something Evelyn seemed unconcerned about. Their company was in danger. 3 major contracts were stalled, shareholder pressure was mounting, and most importantly, tonight, the evaluation result for a $900 million drone contract could be decided, not on paper, but inside this very room. Thomas scanned the hall, his gaze far more tense than Evelyn's. He knew all too well. One small mistake could bring everything crashing down. He leaned toward his wife and whispered, "Tonight is very important. I just hope everything goes smoothly." Evelyn didn't turn to look at him. She replied calmly, "You worry too much." And in her voice was a dangerous confidence. The confidence of someone who had never had to pay for her words. Then Evelyn saw him, the man seated at an inner table close to the central area. Not the most prestigious table, but close enough to signal one thing. He hadn't been invited by accident. He wore a simple, well-fitted navy suit, no flashy tie, no ostentatious watch. He didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened. What unsettled Evelyn wasn't his appearance, nor his clothing. It was the way people around him behaved. A federal official leaned in toward him. A tech investor nodded repeatedly as he spoke. Business cards were exchanged, not out of politeness, but out of respect. Evelyn wasn't used to this, not used to seeing someone like him treated as if he truly belonged here. She leaned toward the close friend seated beside her, her voice low but sharp. "Who invited him?" The friend shrugged. "I'm not sure. Maybe some fund?" Evelyn narrowed her eyes. In her mind, a familiar order was beginning to fracture, and she didn't like it. She looked at Thomas. "Do you know that man?" Thomas followed her gaze, hesitating slightly. "Not really, but he seems to be here. Legitimately." Evelyn turned away, her lips pressed tight. Throughout the evening, she kept glancing toward that table, not out of curiosity, but out of silent offense. Because in Evelyn Harrington's world, certain positions were meant to remain fixed, and certain people were never meant to cross those invisible lines. She took a sip of red wine. The dark liquid spread across her tongue, leaving a faint bitterness behind. No one in that room knew that, in just a few more minutes, that very glass of wine would become the beginning of everything's collapse. And Evelyn still believed she was in control of it all. There are boundaries that are never drawn on marble floors. No ropes, no signs. But in rooms like Liberty Hall, everyone understands that they exist. And Evelyn Harrington believed in those boundaries more than anyone. Soft music played in the background, just enough to fill the silence without disturbing the important conversations. Servers moved gracefully between tables, pouring wine, replacing cutlery, keeping everything running smoothly, just as they always did, just as they were expected to do. Evelyn observed it all with a composed, almost cold gaze. She noticed who was trying too hard to be seen, who was overly eager, who wasn't playing their role well enough. And then her eyes returned to that man, Marcus Cole. He was still there, still composed, still completely indifferent to Evelyn's scrutinizing stares. That bothered her even more. Evelyn was not used to being ignored, and even less used to feeling out of control. She began to notice every small detail. When Marcus stood to shake hands with a federal official, the official Dudong introduced him to others. When a tech investor approached, Marcus didn't rush to hand over a business card. The other man did so first. There was no flattery, no familiar praise from those trying to climb higher. Marcus wasn't seeking validation. He already had it. And to Evelyn, that was an unacceptable paradox. She leaned toward Thomas, her voice low but sharp. "Don't you find that strange?" Thomas exhaled softly. "Strange how?" "He's sitting there as if that seat belongs to him." Thomas followed her gaze. He hesitated for a second, far too long by Evelyn's standards. "I think he was invited properly." Evelyn let out a thin smile. "Being invited doesn't mean you belong." The words drifted lightly, but behind them lay an entire fixed worldview, one Evelyn had lived within for all 44 years of her life. She was born into a family where everything had its order. Who sat at which table, who spoke and when, who was expected to remain silent. These lessons were never spoken aloud. They were passed down through glances, through the way adults subtly changed their tone when addressing outsiders. And Evelyn learned quickly. She learned who deserved a smile, she learned whom to overlook, and most importantly, she learned to believe that some positions were not meant for everyone to touch. Meanwhile, at the other table, Marcus Cole continued his conversation. He asked more than he spoke, listened more than he judged. When a federal official mentioned ethical concerns in technology partnerships, Marcus simply nodded and wrote a note in a small notebook. When someone raised the pressure of profit margins, he didn't argue. He only asked, "And how does that affect the people inside the organization?" A simple question, but one that silenced the table for a few seconds, not because they lacked answers, but because not everyone was accustomed to being questioned that way. Evelyn couldn't hear those words, but she saw the silence, and that silence unsettled her. She turned to the woman beside her, Margaret, a veteran of charity boards and power-filled galas. "I bet he's trying to impress someone." Margaret hesitated slightly. "Or maybe he doesn't need to." Evelyn turned to her, eyes razor-sharp. "Margaret." Just one word, but it was enough to signal that this conversation was over. Thomas sensed the shift in the air. He looked at his wife, then around the room. He noticed phones appearing more frequently on tables, curious glances, quick looks exchanged, as if people were waiting for something. He recognized that look, the look before a storm. Thomas leaned toward Evelyn, his voice lower now. "Please, don't start something." Evelyn set her wine glass down slowly. "Start something? Don't you think he is something?" Thomas swallowed hard. "Tonight is not the time." Evelyn looked him straight in the eyes. "If not now, then when?" There are moments in life when every choice that follows traces back to one very small decision. And Evelyn's decision was formed in that instant. She stood up. No one gave an order. No one stopped her. The soft scrape of a chair against marble was enough to make a few nearby guests turn around. Some held their breath. Others frowned. They sensed something was about to happen, but no one yet dared to name it. Evelyn held her wine glass in her hand. Under the lights, the dark red liquid looked almost heavy. She walked slowly toward the central table. No hurry, no hesitation. In her mind, everything was perfectly clear. There was a man sitting in the wrong place, and someone needed to remind him of that. Marcus Cole looked up as he sensed the shift in the room. He saw Evelyn approaching. His expression was calm, not surprised, not evasive, just a steady gaze, as if he had been waiting for this moment since the beginning of the evening. No one in that room knew that this moment was not merely a social confrontation. It was the intersection of two worlds, one that believed in privilege and one that believed in responsibility. And in just a few minutes, one of those worlds would begin to collapse. There are moments in life when an entire room seems to hold its breath. No one says it out loud, but everyone feels it. Liberty Hall fell into a strange silence, not because the music stopped, but because human instinct was warning them that something was about to cross a line. Evelyn Harrington moved between the banquet tables as if stepping onto an invisible stage. Each click of her heels against the marble floor sounded louder than usual, not because the sound was louder, but because there was no longer any conversation left to drown it out. Some guests lowered their heads and took a sip of wine, pretending not to notice. Others subtly slipped their phones from their pockets and placed them face down on the table, ready, but not yet recording. They were accustomed to power dinners, but no one was accustomed to this feeling. The feeling that someone was about to cross a boundary from which there would be no return. Marcus Cole watched Evelyn approach. He did not rush to stand. He did not avoid her. He simply placed his pen beside the small notebook and closed it carefully, as if finishing one task before beginning another. Those seated at his table began to feel uneasy. A federal official adjusted his collar. A tech investor leaned back slightly. They understood all too well that when a woman like Evelyn Harrington approached on her own, This story would not end with polite small talk. Evelyn stopped at the edge of the table. She did not smile. She didn't need to. Her gaze swept quickly across every face, like a silent inspection. Who mattered? Who was secondary? Then her eyes settled on Marcus. "Sorry to interrupt," Evelyn said, her voice just loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "I believe there's been a small misunderstanding about seating tonight." The air thickened. Marcus looked up, his voice calm. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" The politeness of his address somehow irritated Evelyn even more. She tilted her head slightly, as if examining a foreign object. "I'm Evelyn Harrington." No one in the room didn't know that name, and Evelyn knew that very well. "My family has worked with the federal government for decades. We understand very clearly who tables like this are usually meant for." A federal official beside Marcus nodded politely, but no one spoke. Evelyn continued, her tone still gentle, a calculated softness. "And I'm simply curious, who do you represent?" Marcus replied immediately without hesitation. "I don't represent a company." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Then you represent?" "I'm here to observe and evaluate." That answer caused several faces in the room to change. Evelyn laughed, a short, sharp laugh with no trace of humor. "Evaluate?" "I wasn't aware that was part of tonight's program." By now, Thomas Harrington had stood up from his table. He didn't intervene right away. He simply stood at a distance, his heart beating faster than usual. He recognized the look in his wife's eyes, a look he had seen many times before, the look of someone who believed she could not be wrong. Evelyn set her wineglass on the table, her fingers still gripping it tightly. "I just want to make sure that the people sitting here truly understand where they are." She looked around deliberately, drawing more attention. "This is not a casual social gathering. This is where decisions affecting national security are discussed." Marcus nodded. "I agree." That calm response was like oil poured onto a smoldering flame. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice lowering, but still clear enough for those nearby to hear. "Then you should understand. Not everyone is invited into these conversations because of merit." The air around the table seemed to freeze. Someone started to speak, then stopped. Not because they agreed, but because they didn't want to become the next focal point. Marcus looked directly at Evelyn. "What exactly are you implying?" Evelyn smiled. This time, the smile didn't bother to hide anything. "I'm just saying that, lately, people tend to confuse presence with worthiness." The words fell onto the table like a metal spoon, light yet resonant. Thomas couldn't take it anymore. "Evelyn." She didn't turn around. "Wait. I just want to clarify one thing." Evelyn looked back at Marcus, her eyes no longer hiding their contempt. "Do you truly believe you belong at this table?" A few people inhaled sharply. Some closed their eyes. That question wasn't curiosity. It was judgment. Marcus stood up. He was slightly taller than Evelyn, not threatening, just steady. "I believe I'm exactly where I need to be." His voice was low, clear, without challenge. Evelyn tightened her grip on the wine glass. In her mind, the last remaining boundaries had been erased. "Do you always think that? That you can step into spaces built by others and assume you are their equal?" The room was completely silent. No one pretended not to hear anymore. Evelyn lifted the wine glass, not in a sudden burst of anger, but in a slow, deliberate motion. Marcus looked at her. He didn't step back. He didn't raise a hand to shield himself. He simply looked. That moment lasted less than a second, but in that second, Every possible path forward had already been sealed. And then, the glass tilted. Red wine poured over Marcus Cole's hair, forehead, and shoulders. The dark red spread across the navy suit like a freshly opened wound. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Evelyn placed the empty glass down on the table very softly. "Do you truly think you belong here?" Marcus remained still. Wine dripped onto the marble floor. And then he smiled. Not bitter, not angry, but the smile of someone who had just witnessed a decision being made and knew its consequences were unavoidable. No one in that room knew that this moment would be replayed millions of times, and its cost would not be paid in reputation alone, but in the collapse of an entire empire. There are moments when all noise disappears completely, not because sound stops, but because people no longer know what to say. Liberty Hall sank into a dense silence. No applause, no objections. Only the sound of wine dripping from the edge of Marcus Cole's jacket onto the marble floor. Slow, steady, and hauntingly clear. Evelyn Harrington stood there, back straight, chin slightly raised. She believed she had just reaffirmed order, believed the room needed a reminder. She had no idea that she had just placed the final period on everything. Marcus didn't speak right away. He took out a neatly folded handkerchief from his inner pocket, the movement slow and precise, as if he were accustomed to remaining calm in situations far worse than this. He gently dabbed his jacket. No rush, no irritation. Then he looked up. There was no anger in his eyes, no challenge, only assessment. "An interesting choice," Marcus said, his voice low, just loud enough for those closest to hear. "Very revealing." Just 2 words, but Evelyn felt something was wrong. Not fear, but because for the first time in her life, the other person's reaction lay outside her expectations. Security personnel had moved closer. They didn't intervene, they simply stood there waiting for a signal. A federal official stood up, visibly flustered. "Perhaps we should—" Marcus raised a hand slightly. A small gesture, yet enough to make the man stop. "No need. Tonight has already made things clear." He turned to Evelyn, his tone calm. "You've shared your perspective, and I understand." Evelyn curled her lips, a fleeting sense of victory passing through her. "I'm only saying what many people think." No one agreed, no one nodded, only silence. By now, Thomas Harrington had stepped up beside his wife. His face had gone pale, not from embarrassment, but from a very specific, very real fear. He looked at Marcus, then at Evelyn. "I apologize." Marcus turned to Thomas, interrupting him gently. "You don't need to apologize on anyone's behalf." The words carried no accusation, but they sent a chill down Thomas's spine. Because in the world of those who hold decision-making power, calmness is often more dangerous than anger. The dinner continued, at least in name. The music resumed, but sounded forced. Conversations became scattered, unfocused. No one was truly present at the party anymore. They were present with the moment they had just witnessed. Phones began to light up. Not to take souvenir photos, but to send short videos and hurried messages. "You won't believe what just happened. At Liberty Hall, right now. She just did something irreversible." Evelyn didn't notice, or rather, she chose not to. She returned to her table, sat down, took another sip of wine, as if everything that had happened were nothing more than a minor misunderstanding. But Thomas didn't. He sat motionless, hands clasped beneath the table. His mind raced, assembling each small fragment of information, the looks from the officials, the respect shown toward Marcus, The way that man held control of the room without ever needing to prove anything. Thomas realized something that made his heart sink. That man didn't need to retaliate, didn't need to defend his honor, because his power didn't reside in words. The evening ended earlier than expected. Farewells were rushed. No one wanted to linger in that heavy atmosphere. Evelyn exited Liberty Hall unchanged in posture. She got into the car, adjusted her dress as if leaving an ordinary dinner. Thomas closed the door and sat beside his wife, silent for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "Do you know who that man was?" Evelyn shrugged. "Doesn't matter." Thomas turned to look at her. "I think maybe it does." Evelyn gave a soft laugh. "You're overreacting." But inside Thomas, a dark premonition continued to grow. The next morning, Washington, D.C. woke up to a storm. Not rain, not wind, but a wave of news spreading faster than human reflex. Videos from Liberty Hall appeared across social media. Uncut, unedited. Just raw truth. Headlines flooded in. An action at a gala sparks outrage. When privilege crosses the line. The moment that shook a powerful family. Thomas's phone rang nonstop. Harrington Dynamics stock began to tremble the moment the market opened. Evelyn woke up later. She picked up her phone and scrolled through the first comments. Her face darkened. Not from regret, but from feeling misunderstood as she saw it. They don't understand the context. They don't understand what I was protecting. She started typing a post, deleted it, typed again. Thomas watched from a distance, his chest heavy. He understood that. Last night was only the beginning, and the worst part wasn't what Evelyn had done, it was what she would do next. Because there are people who, when faced with the chance to stop, do not choose reflection. They choose to dig deeper into their own mistake. And Thomas knew all too well, the real storm had only just begun. There are mornings that do not begin with sunlight. They begin with a worry that hasn't yet found a name. Washington, D.C. felt colder than usual that morning, not because of the weather, but because of what was quietly unfolding behind phone screens. Thomas Harrington stood by the office window, looking down at a familiar street that suddenly felt foreign. The phone on his desk vibrated for the 17th time in less than 30 minutes. He didn't need to look to know who was calling. The board of directors, investors, longtime partners, people who had never called him this early before were now calling nonstop. Finally, Thomas picked up. The voice on the other end didn't bother with pleasantries. "We need to talk about the man from last night." Thomas paused for a second. "Who is he?" A brief silence. Then the answer fell like a clean cut. "Marcus Cole, chairman of the Federal Defense Partner Evaluation Board." Thomas felt his chest tighten, not because of the name, but because of the title. He immediately understood what it meant. A meeting was scheduled for that very afternoon. No ceremony, no press, no time to prepare. Thomas entered the federal meeting room with the feeling that he was stepping into a place where every mistake had already been recorded. Marcus Cole was already there. No gala suit, no handkerchief, just simple professional attire. He stood when Thomas entered, a handshake. His gaze was calm, carrying no personal emotion. "Thank you for being on time," Marcus said. The words sent a chill through Thomas, because in this world, being on time was a sign of respect, not leniency. Marcus didn't waste time. He placed a tablet on the table. The screen lit up. The video began to play. Unedited, no music, no cuts. Just Evelyn Harrington and a glass of red wine. Thomas couldn't bring himself to watch until the end. "Last night," Marcus said slowly, "I didn't come to Liberty Hall for a dinner. Thomas looked up. "I came to observe." A simple sentence, but Thomas understood this was not an evaluation of a product. It was an evaluation of people. Marcus continued, "We are selecting a partner for the next generation drone technology program, $900 million, with implications that will last decades." Thomas nodded. He knew. Technically, Marcus went on, Harrington Dynamics was at the top of the list. Thomas's heart sank. "But we are not just purchasing technology. We are placing trust." Marcus looked directly at Thomas. "And last night, I saw enough." There was no reproach, no condemnation, just a conclusion. The decision was delivered plainly. Harrington Dynamics will no longer be considered for this contract. Thomas felt as if the air had been drained from the room. $900 million. Not just money, it was reputation, the future, and the survival of the entire corporation. "I understand," Thomas said, his voice hoarse. "But my wife's actions." Marcus raised a hand, gentle but final. It wasn't a moment. It was a revelation. Those words shattered whatever hope remained. At the same time, elsewhere, Evelyn Harrington was preparing what she believed would be her counterattack. She sat in front of a camera. Lights shone directly onto her carefully made-up face. "I don't regret it," Evelyn said in her first interview. "There are things that need to be said." She believed she was regaining control, that public opinion would soon tire, that everything would eventually settle down. She didn't realize that every word she spoke was hammering another nail into an invisible coffin. That afternoon, the market reacted. Harrington Dynamics stock plunged. Partners postponed meetings. Phone calls grew colder. Thomas came home late. Evelyn was rewatching her interview, looking satisfied. "I think I handled it well," she said. Thomas stood there for a long time. Then he spoke, slowly. "Do you know who that man was?" Evelyn shrugged. "Some official?" Thomas took a deep breath. "He's the one who decides the contract this company survives on." For the first time, Evelyn didn't smile. "What do you mean?" Thomas looked straight at his wife. "I mean, we just lost everything." No shouting, no objects thrown, only silence, heavier than any argument. That night, Evelyn lay awake, not from regret, but because for the first time in her life, she felt the world was no longer on her side. She opened her phone. Comments flooded in. No longer debate, but rejection. She told herself, they don't understand. But deep inside, a question began to echo, quiet, unsettling. If they don't understand, or have I misunderstood my entire life? Evelyn had no answer, but Thomas knew one thing clearly. The truth had knocked on the door, and no one could pretend not to hear it anymore. The collapse was no longer a risk. It had begun. There are consequences that do not arrive with thunder. They arrive with doors closing, very softly. The next morning, Harrington Dynamics headquarters was lit as usual. Employees still came to work. The receptionist still smiled. The coffee machines still hummed steadily. But inside, everything had changed. No more lively conversations, no more extended pleasantries. Only avoided glances and emails written with a precision so careful it felt cold. Thomas Harrington stepped into the 16th floor conference room with a heavy pressure in his chest. He didn't need to check the calendar to know what day it was. An emergency board meeting. Not to analyze, not to debate, but to decide who would pay the price. The meeting room was sealed, lit by white light. No windows, no artwork on the walls, only a long table and 11 people accustomed to deciding the fate of thousands. Richard Harrington, Thomas's father and the company's founder, sat at the head of the table. Silver. Hair, straight back. The warmth of a father's favor was gone from his eyes. What remained was the severity of a guardian of legacy. "We'll begin," he said. No one objected. Numbers appeared on the screen. The stock had dropped 20% in just 2 days. 3 major partners had suspended cooperation. 1 investment fund had withdrawn until further information becomes available. No explanation was needed. The name Evelyn Harrington hovered in the room like an unspoken taboo. Finally, Richard spoke again. "We need to address Evelyn's actions." No one looked at Thomas. No one needed to. He took a deep breath. "I take responsibility as CEO." Richard shook his head slowly. "No. You bear responsibility as the one who stayed silent." The words were not raised, but they struck the very thing Thomas had been avoiding for the past 2 days. Another board member spoke up. "This isn't a personal incident. It's a cultural issue." Someone else followed. "We've ignored too many warning signs." A stack of documents was pushed to the center of the table. Old complaints, out-of-court settlements, human resources reports that had once been quietly filed away. No one said Evelyn's name, but everyone knew. Thomas felt his throat tighten. He remembered the times Evelyn had made inappropriate remarks at gatherings, the times he chose silence, the times he told himself, "It's just words." He hadn't realized that his silence had turned those words into power. Richard stood up. The room fell completely still. "We have 2 choices," he said. "Protect the old image and sink together. Or remove what has become necrotic to save what remains." No one asked which part. The decision came faster than Thomas expected. Evelyn Harrington was removed from all positions connected to the corporation. Her authority to represent the company was revoked. Family funds were frozen pending internal investigation. 11 hands went up without hesitation. Thomas was the last to vote. In that moment, he understood that he had just lost a marriage to save what his father had spent a lifetime building. Evelyn learned the news that afternoon, not from Thomas, but from a short, cold email. She read it again and again, unable to believe it. "They can't do this." She called Thomas. No answer. She called her father-in-law. No response. For the first time in her life, Evelyn Harrington had no one left to intervene on her behalf. That evening, Thomas came home early. Evelyn was sitting in the living room, her phone on the table, the screen still blowing. "You knew about this?" she asked. Thomas nodded. Evelyn sprang to her feet. "You let them do this?" Thomas looked at his wife for a long time. No anger, no reproach, just exhaustion. "I let this happen a long time ago," he said. That night was just the first time no one could look away anymore. Evelyn let out a scoff. "So you chose them?" Thomas shook his head gently. "I chose consequences." Silence settled over the room. No one cried, no one shouted, because they both understood. This wasn't an argument. It was an ending. That night, Thomas slept in his office. He stared at the ceiling, thinking about the question he had avoided for years. If I had spoken up sooner, would things have been different? He had no answer, only the knowledge that choices not made at the right time become unavoidable choices later. Across the city, Evelyn sat alone. No camera, no lights, no audience. Just a woman facing reality for the first time without privilege as a shield. She replayed the video from Liberty Hall, this time not to argue, but to watch. And in a very brief moment, Evelyn noticed something that unsettled her more than any criticism. A man who had been humiliated, yet still retained his dignity. And she, the one who believed she had won, was sitting here, losing everything. Evelyn turned off the screen. Outside, the city lights still burned bright, but for her, the longest night of her life had only just begun. There is a very strange moment in a person's life. It's the moment when every door has closed, and there is no one left to blame but yourself. For Evelyn Harrington, that moment arrived on a very ordinary morning. No cameras, no reporters, no lights. Only the sound of a doorbell echoing through a mansion that had once symbolized power and safety. Evelyn walked down the stairs, still wearing her expensive silk pajamas, clothes that had once made her feel as if she belonged to a different class altogether. She assumed it might be a delivery person or a former assistant coming to collect belongings. But when she opened the door, she saw two men standing there. Dark suits, serious eyes. One of them spoke, polite but firm. "Ms. Evelyn Harrington?" She nodded. "We're here to deliver an official notice." They didn't need to say more. Evelyn already understood. A stack of papers was placed into her hands. Thick, heavy. Not because of the number of pages, but because of what they represented. When the door closed, the house fell so silent that Evelyn could hear her own heartbeat. She sat down on the sofa, placed the papers on the table. She didn't open them right away. For years, Evelyn had been used to others waiting for her, waiting for a glance, waiting for a decision, waiting for a nod. Today, for the first time, she was the one being notified. The days that followed moved slowly. Evelyn's phone no longer rang nonstop. No interview requests, no messages asking for her opinion. A few old friends called, not to check in, but to confirm. "I heard that story is true. Are things okay?" Every question sounded the same, gentle but distant. Evelyn began to realize a painful truth. Some relationships exist only as long as you remain on top. Thomas no longer came home. Lawyers sent emails, short, professional. Those emotionless words severed what had once been a 20-year marriage faster than any argument ever could. Evelyn finished reading and sat still. No tears, no anger, just emptiness. For the first time in her life, Evelyn drove somewhere on her own, without a clear destination. She passed through streets she had previously seen only through the tinted windows of luxury cars, neighborhoods without gated entrances, small shops with dim yellow lights. She parked in a public lot, sat there for a long time. For the first time, she felt something she had never had to face before. She was just an ordinary person. No one knew who she was. No one made way for her. No one paid attention. And that made her feel both frightened and disoriented. The nights grew longer. Evelyn lay on her wide bed, yet felt as if she were curled up in an empty room. She replayed the video from Liberty Hall, this time not to argue. She watched every second. Watched Marcus's eyes. Watched the moment she lifted the wine glass. She asked herself, not for the first time, but for the first time seriously, why did I do that? Not because he insulted her. Not because she felt threatened, but because he wasn't afraid of her. The realization sent a shiver through Evelyn. A week later, her lawyer called again. "There's a clause regarding social responsibility," he he said. If you want a lighter resolution, you'll need to complete a community service program. Evelyn let out a dry laugh. Community service. In the past, the phrase had appeared only in her speeches. Now, it had become a requirement. On the first day, Evelyn walked into a community support center on the outskirts of the city. No red carpet, no luxury air conditioning, just the smell of cheap coffee and overlapping voices. She was handed an apron. The supervisor spoke briefly. Here, everyone is the same. Evelyn nodded, though resistance churned inside her. Until she noticed a man sitting in the corner. Sun-weathered skin, tired eyes. He looked up at her. No judgment, no admiration. Just a very human look. And for the first time in weeks, Evelyn didn't know where she was supposed to stand. That afternoon, she washed her hands for a long time, not because they were dirty, but because the sensation felt unfamiliar. She realized, here, no one cared who she used to be. They only cared about what she was doing. When Evelyn left the center, it was already dark. She stood at the entrance, looking back at the worn-down building behind her. No sense of victory, no sharp shame, just a very small, very vague thought, one that refused to disappear. Maybe this is the first time I'm truly standing on equal ground with others. Evelyn got into the car. The door closed, and somewhere, deep inside, something she had never named before began to stir. Not regret, not forgiveness, but confrontation. And she understood. Her fall wasn't over yet, but for the first time, it was no longer entirely meaningless. Real change rarely arrives to applause. It doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need praise. It comes quietly, quiet enough that even the person changing doesn't notice it right away. For Evelyn Harrington, that change didn't begin with a grand apology. It didn't begin with tears. It began with exhaustion. In the mornings that followed, Evelyn woke up earlier, not because she had meetings scheduled, but because there was no longer any reason to sleep in. The large house felt excessive. No one asked what she needed to wear that day. No one waited for her decisions. Only the wall clock ticked steadily, as if reminding her that time kept moving, whether she was ready to move on or not. Evelyn put on her coat and drove to the community center. The sharp resistance she'd felt on the first day was gone, but nothing yet felt like willingness either. It was simply that she had nowhere else to go. At the center, everything was the same. Old wooden tables, mismatched chairs, people carrying their own stories, each one heavier than Evelyn had ever imagined. She began to get used to the rhythm there, making coffee, wiping tables, handing out meals. No one asked what she used to do. No one was curious about her former life. For the first time in her life, Evelyn was not the center of any room. And that no longer terrified her the way it once had. One afternoon, as she was wiping down a table, Evelyn heard a voice behind her. "Are you new?" She turned around. The man from before, the one who had unsettled her with nothing more than an ordinary look, was standing there. Gray hair, a worn jacket, a frayed backpack. "I see you work hard," he said, without judgment. "Not everyone comes back after the first day." Evelyn nodded. I'm trying." He smiled faintly. "Trying is enough for today." The words stayed with her longer than she expected. In the days that followed, Evelyn began to listen more. Not listening in order to respond, not to correct, just listening. She listened to a woman talk about being laid off after asking for time to care for her child. She listened to a veteran describe the feeling of being forgotten after coming home. She listened to stories she used to skim past in newspapers, Stories she had always believed must have had some reason. Now, sitting across from them, she wasn't so certain anymore. There were moments when Evelyn wanted to speak, to explain, to defend the world she once believed was right. But then she remembered Marcus Cole's eyes. Not angry, not condemning, just a look that saw straight through. And she chose silence. Not out of fear, but because, for the first time, she understood that she didn't yet understand enough to speak. One evening after the center had emptied out, Evelyn stayed behind to help clean up. She found an old photograph pinned to the notice board. A group of volunteers from years earlier. Diverse faces, simple smiles. None of them famous, none of them powerful, but they stood there as themselves. Evelyn stared at the photo for a long time. A thought crossed her mind that surprised even her. Maybe I spent my entire life trying to stand above others without ever learning how to stand beside them. Small changes continued. Evelyn stopped wearing clothes designed to draw attention, not as an act of humility, but because she no longer needed that validation. She began to read, not business news, not rankings or lists, but human stories, things she once considered irrelevant. Each page felt like a new question, one that didn't demand an immediate answer. One rainy afternoon, Evelyn sat in her car, watching raindrops slide down the windshield. She thought back to the night at Liberty Hall. There was no defensiveness now, no anger, only a stark truth. That night, she hadn't hurt Marcus Cole nearly as much as she had exposed herself. The realization hurt, but it also freed her. Elsewhere, in the city, Marcus Cole continued his work. No interviews, no statements. He had nothing left to prove. But in internal reports, a change was being proposed. Not because of public pressure, but because of a question that had been raised that night. Are we giving power to the right kind of people? Evelyn didn't know any of this. She only knew that one very ordinary evening, as she washed the last of the dishes, the center supervisor said to her, "If you'd like, we could use a regular volunteer starting next week." Evelyn looked up. No pressure, no conditions, no cameras, just an offer. She was silent for a few seconds. Then she nodded. "I'll come." And in that moment, Evelyn Harrington understood. Redemption is not about being forgiven. It's about continuing to do the right thing, even when no one is watching. Outside, the city kept moving. New headlines appeared. Other stories took over the spotlight. But for Evelyn, this was the first time in her life. She was no longer chasing the world. She was learning how to live within it. And sometimes, that is the hardest change of all, and the truest. Time does not heal every wound, but it always exposes the truth. And for Evelyn Harrington, that truth arrived on a very quiet afternoon, as she stood before a mirror in a room that no longer belonged to her. The old mansion had been sold, not because money was immediately scarce, but because there was no longer any reason to keep it. Evelyn moved into a small apartment in the suburbs, 1 bedroom, 1 living room, a space just large enough not to run away. She set her suitcase down on the floor and looked around. No paintings on the walls, no antiques, no traces of a life once surrounded by power. Just her. The first days were hard. No one called to ask for her opinion. No one waited for her decisions. No one spoke the name Harrington with reverence anymore. Evelyn had once believed that losing status meant losing everything. But what hurt her the most was losing the feeling of being important. Some evenings, she sat on the sofa and turned on the television just to hear voices. Not to watch anything, just to have sound, so the room wouldn't feel so empty. And in that emptiness, questions began to appear, uninvited. When did I start believing that a person's value depended on where they sat? When did I start thinking that other people's silence meant agreement? And when did I stop seeing people as people? Those questions didn't come with answers. They simply stayed, long enough that they could no longer be ignored. Evelyn continued going to the community center, no longer out of obligation, no longer because of a legal clause, simply because she knew she needed to be there. One morning, while organizing files for a job counseling session, she saw the older man again, the veteran she had helped a few times before. He looked at her and smiled. "You're still here?" Evelyn nodded. "Yes." He thought for a moment, then said, "Not many people come back once they're no longer required to." The words weren't praise. They weren't criticism, but they held Evelyn in place for a long time. Meanwhile, the world outside continued to change. Harrington Dynamics began appearing in the news again, not as a powerful corporation, but as a case study in painful yet necessary restructuring. Thomas Harrington rarely gave interviews. When he did, he said only one thing: "We stayed silent for too long, and the cost of silence always comes later." Evelyn read those words late one evening. She wasn't angry. She didn't feel blamed. Just a strange sensation, like watching a former life from the other side of a river. 1 year after the night at Liberty Hall, Evelyn stood before a small classroom at the community center, not as a speaker, but as a support volunteer. She helped people write resumes, fill out job applications, prepare for their first interviews after years of unemployment. A young woman looked up at her and asked, "Do you think they'll give me a chance?" Evelyn didn't answer right away. She remembered herself a year earlier, believing that opportunities were guaranteed. Now she said slowly, "You can't control their decision, but you can control how you walk into that room." The woman nodded, her eyes brightening slightly. Evelyn realized something. For the first time, her words didn't come from position, they came from experience. Another afternoon, after the center had closed, Evelyn sat alone, watching the sunset spill through a small window. She thought about Marcus Cole. Not with fear, not with resentment, but with a strange sense of gratitude. If he had reacted in anger that night, if he had raised his voice, if he had made a scene, she might have found an excuse to defend herself. But he didn't. He let her face herself. And that was the hardest thing of all. Evelyn didn't know if she would ever be fully forgiven. She wasn't even sure she deserved to be. But she began to understand one thing. Redemption is not about erasing the past. It's about living so that the past does not repeat itself. Late one night, Evelyn wrote in a small notebook, something she had only recently begun to keep. Some people spend their entire lives climbing upward and lose everything in a single moment. But there are also those who, only when they stand on equal ground with others, learn for the first time what it means to be human. She closed the notebook. Outside, the city was still loud. Other stories were still unfolding. Other tragedies were still waiting to be told. But the story of Evelyn Harrington was no longer a story about collapse. It became a story about responsibility. About a person who, after losing everything that once defined her, chose not to rebuild a pedestal for herself, but learned to stand on the ground with both feet. And sometimes, that is the true beginning of a life. There are mistakes that cannot be undone, but there are still people who can change. The remaining question is not whether Evelyn will be forgiven. It is this: if you were in her place when power and privilege are gone, who would you choose to become? yours alone to give. Some stories do not end in victory. They end with understanding. And sometimes that is the hardest ending to accept. On an early autumn morning, Evelyn Harrington left her small apartment earlier than usual. Washington that day was clear, softly sunlit with a light breeze. The city looked gentler than it had a year ago, or perhaps it was simply that her way of seeing it had changed. She locked the door, slipped the key into her pocket, and stood still for a few seconds before walking away. There was no luxury car waiting, no packed schedule, no one needing her to arrive on time to preserve appearances. And the strange thing was, she no longer felt left behind. Evelyn walked to the community center as she did every day. There, everything felt familiar. The old notice board, the hurried smell of coffee, the soft conversations among people who had been overlooked for far too long. A young woman waved at her. A veteran nodded as she walked in. No one called her by the Harrington name. No one knew her past. They only knew Evelyn, the woman who showed up consistently, listened, and didn't walk away. There was one very small moment Evelyn never forgot. That day, a middle-aged man came in asking for help finding work. His paperwork was disorganized. His hand trembled as he held the pen. He apologized repeatedly for the gaps in his resume, for the years no one wanted to hear about. Evelyn looked at him and said gently, "It's okay. We'll start from here." He looked up, surprised. Not because the words were extraordinary, but because, for the first time in a long while, someone was speaking to him like a normal human being. After he left, Evelyn remained seated for a long time. She thought of herself a year earlier, also standing at a moment when everything had to begin again from zero. The only difference was this. Back then, she didn't know she needed to relearn how to be human. That afternoon, Evelyn stopped by a small used bookstore near the center. Not to look for knowledge, just to exist in a space that demanded nothing from her. She picked up a thin book with a worn cover. On the first page was a handwritten line from someone long ago. A person's value does not lie in how high they stand, but in whether they dare to stand on equal ground with others. Evelyn closed the book. Some things, if read at another time, she would have passed over, but now, those words stayed. At the same time, elsewhere in the city, larger changes were quietly taking place. New procedures, new standards, evaluations no longer based solely on numbers and profit, but on how people treat other people. Not everyone was pleased. Not everyone changed. But a door had opened, and it would not be easy to close again. Evelyn was not in those rooms. No one invited her. No one mentioned her name as a central figure. And this time, she did not feel excluded, because for the first time in her life, she no longer needed to be at the center to feel that she existed. One evening, Evelyn sat by the window of her small apartment. Streetlights cast long streaks of light across the wall. She held her phone and scrolled through old photos, galas, red carpets, smiles, once so confident. She didn't delete them, she didn't linger on them either. The past doesn't disappear just because we want it to. But it doesn't have to define us forever. Evelyn set the phone down. She opened her small notebook and wrote a few lines. There were things I once thought were everything. Power, status, winning. But when I lost them, I realized I still had a choice to become a better human being than I was yesterday. She closed the notebook. Outside, the city continued to live, unconcerned with who she once was. And this time, that no longer hurt. This story is not meant to excuse mistakes, nor is it meant to erase the past. It simply presents an uncomfortable truth. Power does not reveal who you are. It only gives you the opportunity to show it. Some people need only a single moment to lose everything, but there are others who, only after losing everything, begin to learn how to live rightly. And sometimes, justice is not loud. It arrives quietly, through responsibility, through change, through the decision not to turn away one more time. You may never stand in a room full of power like Liberty Hall, but every day we stand before smaller choices, how we look at others, how we treat them when we think no one is watching. If this story made you pause for even a second to reflect, share your feelings in the comments, not to judge, just to listen to one another a little more. If you believe that deep human stories can help us slow down and live more kindly, please like, share, and subscribe to Deep Life Tales. Thank you for staying until the final moment. We'll meet again in the next story, where life is not told through glory, but through moments that are deeply human.